Today we're starting a new series, and for the next several months, we're going to read through the Gospel of Matthew together, chapter by chapter. We're not doing literally every verse, okay? But starting with chapter 8, we're going to hear one story at a time to experience Matthew as not a series of isolated teachings, but as one living story with movement. And it's a story that begins from the very beginning with tension. Let's just talk a little bit about the context, starting with chapter 1, which, if you didn't know, is just a genealogy. And we usually just skip over it because it's one impossible name to pronounce after another and a series of beget and begotten. But Matthew begins with this for a reason, because right away we learn that Jesus was not born to a pure or perfect family, but one that's marked by relatives engaged in scandals from prostitution to murder. And of course there's his mother who gets pregnant before marriage, and a father who chooses compassion over shame. And in chapter 2, his birth terrifies a paranoid King Herod who lashes out in violence, forcing Jesus to spend his earliest years as a refugee family escaping a massacre and political terror. And so in chapter 3, as a young man, he stood in the waters of baptism as a form of solidarity with all of humankind. And in chapter 4, he is led into the wilderness where he experiences loneliness and hunger and the human temptations to power and domination and religious manipulation. And he rejects it all and then begins calling disciples, and he goes and he teaches in the synagogues and he heals people with every kind of disease and pain, and growing crowds come to hear him announce the kingdom of heaven, which in chapter 5 he addresses those crowds on a mountainside and describes an entirely different kind of world, right? Blessed are the poor, the grieving, blessed are the merciful, the peacemakers. He taught them, you have heard it said, hate your enemies. But I say, love your enemies. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye, but I say to you, pray for those who hate you. And then in chapters 6 and 7, he presents this way of life that runs counter to nearly every popular notion that we have about success or power, revenge and self-protection. He challenges fear and exclusion and violence and performative religion and imperial power. And then he comes down the mountain in chapter 8. This is where we watch him walk right into all those teachings practiced in real life, not in abstract ideals. And he does all of this with mercy and healing love, radical love. And so today, here we are. He's down from the mountain, and the very first thing he does is reach out and touch someone everyone else avoids. And it's a shocking demonstration of the very mercy he just spoke of. And then a Roman centurion comes to him asking Jesus to heal his servant. Later in the day, he calms terrified disciples during a severe storm on the water, and from there confronts demons whom Jesus orders into a herd of pigs who rush off a cliff and drown. See, it's all in a day's work. Though the story involving the leper is an important symbol, a signal of inclusion to those who are outcast, I actually think the more shocking story involves the Roman centurion. I also think it's the one that's most challenging to us as followers today. So in the story, Jesus enters the village of Capernaum. This is a crossroads of the Roman Empire. There's always lots of traders passing through from exotic countries. There's always soldiers there taxing the commerce and enforcing order. And this centurion, a captain of those soldiers, comes to Jesus in a panic, pleading, Master, my servant is sick, he's in terrible pain. And Jesus said, okay, I'll come and heal him. And he says, oh, no, I don't want to put you to all that trouble. You just give the order and my servant will be fine. And Jesus is taken aback. How could he have such faith? And after our reading, he goes on to explain what not everyone is going to want to hear. This outsider is just the beginning of something bigger. People from everywhere are going to come into the kingdom I am proclaiming. Outsiders, foreigners, unexpected people. And they had already seen it with the leper. Of course, that's all fine and good. But then he added, and some of those who assumed automatically belonged are going to be shocked to discover they're completely at odds with what God is doing. And a stunned crowd watches Jesus turn to the captain and say, what you believed could happen has happened. And at that very moment, his servant became well. The crowd was stunned because centurions represented everything that makes their life hard. This wasn't simply a guy doing his job. He enabled the very machinery that ground down their daily life. And Jesus, this is early in his ministry, he could have scored an easy win by appearing to stand up for the little guy. He could have said, you evil and wicked man, go away. You don't deserve my time and attention. And you could just hear the cheers. Yeah, Jesus, you tell him. But Jesus has just come down the mountain where he preached this entirely different kind of world in which you love your enemies and where you pray for those who persecute you. And he had said, blessed are the merciful. And so Jesus doesn't dismiss him. He has a conversation with him. But to be clear, helping the centurion isn't to excuse the oppression of the Roman Empire. What he's doing is teaching them not to surrender their hearts to hatred or fear. In 1971, Durham, North Carolina was torn apart over school desegregation. Black families were exhausted by generations of unequal schools and broken promises, and white families resented change. The threats were constant, the tension was constant, and to calm things down, city leaders organized what they called a charrette, which in reality was 10 exhausting days of public meetings where angry parents, activists, clergy, and community leaders were forced to keep coming back into the same room together. And there were two appointed co-chairs. One was Ann Atwater, an outspoken black community organizer. She was fearless and done being polite, unwilling to tolerate any more nonsense. And the other was C.P. Ellis, the exalted cyclops of the Ku Klux Klan. This is not a former Klansman or someone rethinking his ideas. This was an active Klan leader who was openly hostile and wore his racism unapologetically. He even refused to sell gasoline to black customers at his gas station. Well, those meetings were ugly. The two co-chairs argued constantly. You people want everything handed to you. And fired back. You people have had your foot on our neck for generations. But remarkably, neither one of them walked away. And CP received condemnation from fellow Klansmen for participating in this exercise. But Anne also faced criticism because how could you work with someone so closely representing violent white supremacy? Now, their story was turned into a really good movie. It's called The Best of Enemies. It's streaming right now. It's played by Taraji P. Henson and Sam Rockwell. And they capture that tension so well. And then we see what begins to happen. Not agreement. Conversation. About their children, about medical bills, about working long hours and trying to survive. both feeling ignored by politicians and manipulated by powerful people who keep poor black and poor white communities angry at each other while nothing changes. Well, things really do change when CP realizes or begins to realize that the KKK has given him someone to hate. But that hate hasn't done anything to make his life better. And after those 10 exhausting days of arguments and conversations and long meetings, on the last night, Ellis stood up in front of that packed room and did the unthinkable. He cast the final deciding vote to desegregate the schools. And he held up his KKK membership card and tore it in half. The room went silent, and it cost him. His life was in danger from the Klan. He lost everything in his standing in this world where he once was given authority and identity. Now, racism didn't automatically disappear, of course, but two people the system wanted to remain permanent enemies. They had spent enough time face to face that they began to see each other as human beings. And Jesus saw a man standing in front of him wearing the uniform of the very system making life miserable for his people. He stood in front of Jesus pleading for someone he cared about. And Jesus makes a choice in front of the whole crowd. The crowd would have loved it, I imagine, if he had humiliated him. But what he demonstrates is this. You can assert what he's doing is brutal and still not surrender your heart or your humanity to hatred and fear. Gospel refuses the easy temptation to divide the world into pure good guys and pure bad guys. And that is so much harder than making people into enemies and then walking away. In Durham, North Carolina, something real shifted. The process that Ann Atwater and C.P. Ellis co-led made actual progress in reducing violence and integrating Durham schools more peacefully. And the two remained friends for the rest of their lives. And when Ellis died in 2005, Ann delivered the eulogy at his funeral. Now, the city didn't solve racism, but the Atwater-Ellis story became part of Durham's moral memory. They saw enemies speak to each other differently, proof that a system of entrenched hostility did not have to define the future. Not then. And a system of entrenched hostility need not define our future today. But what do? Because theirs is not a plea that can't we just all get along? No, the question Jesus answers is, how do my disciples resist injustice without becoming consumed by hatred? And he answers, by loving your enemies. Not payback for those who persecute you, but prayer. Because once hatred becomes the thing driving us, we're no longer following Jesus down the mountain. Following the road of Jesus, a name that is healing, a name that brings life, means refusing to let hatred have the divine drive of our life. It does not allow fear to have the last word. It means letting love break down the strongholds and the barriers that separate us. Amen.